Thank you for coming. My name is Christopher Lantz. And I'd like to tell you the very, very sad story of this unplayed string quartet. It was commissioned by a well-known string quartet in New York, and I wrote it in New Mexico. And when it was finished, I carried the score on a plane and arrived in New York. The next day, in a concert hall, I and the musicians gathered, and I explained the quartet to them, and they pulled out their instruments and sat down and began playing. That lasted 10 minutes, in which case they gathered their instruments and put them away and took off. And one of them said over his shoulders, "That can't be played." And I said, "Is a backward shot?" Well, that didn't go very well. That afternoon, the curator from, I can't remember if it was the Modern Art or the Frick, called me and said, "I hear you painted a string quartet." And I said, "Yes, I have. Can I see it, please?" And I said, "Well, why don't you come up this afternoon?" So she did and looked at it, and she said, "I'm creating a show of all the composers who are creating alternate notation. And I've gathered, I can't remember whether it's 108 or 180. And the show's taking place in galleries and museums throughout the city. And I want to have that painting." And I said, "Well, you can have it." I jotted down my address in New Mexico, and I said, "You know, when you're finished, send it to me." And that was that. I arrived in New Mexico and did other things, and somebody came out from New York and said, "Well, it was a neat show. I saw it in the Modern Art, the Frick, the YMCA of New York, which is really prestigious, a couple other places. If I had been an artist, I would have given my teeth to have a show like that." And also I found out that this was the headpiece for the whole show. And furthermore, that the curator tried to get a string quartet to play it, but by that time everybody in New York knew that this was death. And for all God's money, nobody would play it, but it went around. Then some time later, I received this big crate, and I knew what was in it, so I put it away in my studio and refused to open it for years and years. Then eventually I opened it because I needed the crate to ship off paintings somewhere else. And I took this and put it in the furthest corner possible. More years passed. And then one day I called dear woman and said, "I'm coming to visit you." And she said, "Well, do you have that painting that's never been played?" I said, "Yeah." And she said, "Why don't you bring it with you, because we could do a declay of it." Maybe. Giclay. Right? Mm-hmm. And so, okay. So I arrived, and she said, "Did you bring the painting?" And I said, "Yes." And so I brought it in and showed it to her, and I think I said something like, "Well, I wish I could hear this." And she said, "Well, why don't we?" I said, "You gotta be kidding. I mean, you know, New York won't play it. What's gonna happen here?" Well, if anybody knows Dear Woman in Tamara, they know that they don't move mountains, they move glaciers and mountainsides, whole planets. So within 3 days, they had a quartet. And I said, "This is not going to work." So anyway, I took the morning of the rehearsal off and studied the quartet. And I said, "Wow, that's pretty neat. There's structures in here." And all of a sudden I started remembering how I put it together. And I said, "Wow, that's fantastic. That's just, you can do that to that, and wow, it's neat." So the first rehearsal was with Fred and Blaine. Yeah, and we got through it, and they didn't walk away. Then the next rehearsal was with the cellist and Chris, and we went through it again, and they didn't walk away. And then the next day after that, the storm hit. And so that was that, I thought. But no, in spite of the fact that our cellist had taken off for the shores of Mexico, it struck me as a really intelligent thing to do. We didn't have anybody to play it. But this incredible being who has the bass said, well, maybe I could help. Maybe we could move it up an octave and transcribe it. So Mike and I got together, and she played it. She said, I think I can do it. And she didn't walk away. So here we have a quartet. This is an extremely complex quartet. It is not improvisational in any sense at all. There's areas open to interpretation, but it is not improvisational. Furthermore, each musician, for the most part, is responsible for a particular section, which the whole group has to be sensitive to. It's a different form of complexity. There's mechanical complexity, there's spiritual complexity, and there's kind of a musical complexity. And this definitely is beyond that. All the musicians, you can hide behind a hiding string quartet, but in this work, your soul shows. It certainly turned me around, because after the first few minutes when the full quartet played, I had to take a real step back and knew that something had taken place within me or our universe, because 26 years ago I would have been delighted with somebody understanding the complexity, the process, and what it was about. All of a sudden I found myself naked, because everything had changed, because I was hearing it, and I had changed perhaps vastly, because it became a string quartet. It is nothing more than a string quartet. It is its own music. It is not about complexity. It's not about anything. And I think I realized that maybe we got out of the age of avant-garde. Avant-garde came from the Romantic period, really, because in the Romantic period, people started writing about stuff. Tchaikovsky, 1812 Overture, the defeat and retreat of a vast army through the wilderness snow of Russia. And there were a lot more composers writing about stuff. And the avant-garde was all about things. It just wasn't stories anymore. It was about ideas, and it was about concepts, and revolution, and spirituality, and all sorts of stuff. Even Cage's 2 minutes and some odd seconds is about, well, it's about a lot of things, but it's also mostly about silence. This is not about anything. It's just its own quartet. And it taught me. I thank you very, very much.